In my sometimes not so humble opinion, there are two subjects which don't get talked about enough. One of them gets discussed freely on the internet, but not so much in day-to-day life, and that is religion, specifically discussing it and examining it critically. Many of my previous videos have dealt with this subject, so I won't go into much detail here. Suffice to say, it's frowned upon to openly and publicly criticize religion in my part of the world. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that in some parts of the world it would be suicidal to do so. I think that religion, on the whole, is destructive, and should be scrutinized in the cold light of day. And if it turns out that its premises are false, then that conclusion should not be suppressed. I must emphasize, though, that I'm opposed to the religion, and not necessarily the people who hold the beliefs and follow the doctrine. The other elephant in the room is overpopulation. As far as I'm concerned, this is one of the most important topics for conversation, yet it is hardly mentioned on TV or in the newspapers. Almost every time I bring it up, I encounter resistance. Many people who hear the word overpopulation automatically assume that I'm pro-genocide, pro-abortion and pro-eugenics. Even when I tell them that this is as wrong as they could possibly be about me, they don't seem to hear.
Not listening.
So I will give some of the reasons I think overpopulation is a very real problem in the world today. First of all, we need to understand what the human population is today and how rapidly it reached that level. I'm going to play a trailer for a film called Mother, which illustrates this well.
So the only thing we can be sure about in human population studies is that for the last 100,000 years, people on average had 2 children to succeed them, or there would have been a population explosion 1,000 years ago.
In just the last nanosecond of human history, which began 10,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture, we began to change the way we looked at the earth, something that we separated ourselves from. It is the basis for our civilization today.
We've spread notions of proper sanitation as we've vaccinated for diseases, as we've provided famine relief and basic levels of health care. We see an unintended consequence of our best intentions.
By adding fossil fuels to our agriculture, we have allowed population to simply skyrocket.
Today, in 2013, we have passed the 7 billion mark, and the numbers are still rising. The second and very important point is that the number itself is not the most important factor. It's the demand we make on the planet as a species which we need to focus on. In Europe and North America, we consume far more natural resources per capita than the average person in India or sub-Saharan Africa. The thing we call quality of life is almost always heavily dependent on resources such as oil and clean water. And as so-called third world countries do this thing we call developing, the demand for more cars, more refrigerators, more microwave ovens and so on will rise and rise. Although I would argue that it would be better if fewer people had cars and those who did drove them less, I'd be a hypocrite if I insisted on enforcing such ideas. The thing which seems clear as day to me is that an overall increase in the number of humans on this finite planet is unsustainable in the long term. One of the arguments used against mine is that overpopulation is a conspiracy cooked up by the so-called Illuminati or New World Order, who want to cull 90% of humanity with airliner vapour trails, vaccines, fluoride in the water, and so on. I have grown to despise conspiracy theories, in the same way many ex-Christians now despise Christianity. I'm ashamed to admit how gullible I used to be. These conspiracy theorists also insist that there is plenty room for more people. They usually name some city and say that 7 billion could stand shoulder to shoulder within that small area. When they do this, they completely miss the point that standing room only does not equal long-term survival. You could probably cram 100 mice into a biscuit tin, but it doesn't take a genius to work out that they wouldn't survive for very long in there. I learned this ecological lesson as a kid in the following way. I had an aquarium with tropical fish in it. Their ecosystem requires that the water is maintained at a temperature between 22 and 28 degrees Celsius. They need a pH not too far from 7 and very low levels of ammonia and nitrites. A filtration system with a healthy colony of bacteria takes care of this by feeding on the ammonia and nitrites and converting them to nitrates, which are harmless to the fish at levels below about 30 parts per million. Regular partial water changes are required to keep the nitrate levels low, and the water must not contain too much chlorine, or else that will kill the beneficial bacteria in the filter medium. Overfeeding or overcrowding the fish will result in too much ammonia, and the weaker fish will become ill and ultimately die. The number one mistake people make when they set up a new aquarium is to put too many fish in it too quickly, before the naturally occurring bacteria colony in the filter has had time to establish. I wish all employees in pet superstores were aware of these basic facts. So the point of all this is to illustrate by analogy that overpopulation in a finite ecosystem is unsustainable in the long term. Our filtration system consists of healthy oceans and forests. When we burn oil and coal, which has taken millions of years to form, and we do it within a few hundred years, it's inevitable that we're going to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere and the water. We can argue about how much we have done this and how much of an effect it has had, but that's straying away from my main point. That we have evolved to thrive in an environment with very specific chemical properties, and to alter those properties may not be the most sensible thing to do. So, you might be thinking, what do I propose to do about overpopulation? Very simply, I'd like more and more people to be aware that it is a problem and to understand why. I would also advocate that all women should have the freedom to decide whether to have children or not, and to have easy access to contraceptives, should they choose to use them. This ties in with the other elephant in the room I mentioned earlier. Religion has a track record of encouraging its followers to be fruitful and multiply and to subdue the earth. I think we've done both those things more effectively than the writers of the holy books could have ever imagined. Only the ill-informed would think we still need to be doing that, in my opinion. So what I'm suggesting is voluntary population stabilization or reduction. If we could distribute our resources more fairly and reduce our consumption of non-renewables, I see no reason why the Earth couldn't sustain 7 billion. But if we continue to grow the way we are, I predict more war, more famine, and ultimately, nature will cull our numbers for us. I'd hate to see that happen. I would also hate to see governments enforcing sterilization and/or genocide. That would be unspeakably horrific, yet my opponents constantly accuse me of promoting exactly that. It's incredibly frustrating. What can I do, apart from telling them to pay attention to what I am saying, rather than what their preconceived notions are about someone like me? In case any of you are wondering, I'm heterosexual and married. I'm in my late 30s and have no children or plans to bring any into the world. I do have nephews and nieces I care about, but I don't have an overwhelming urge to be a father. Life is too busy and finances are unstable, but I wouldn't rule out having one child in the future, or better still, adopting an orphan or two. I'm more concerned with children and people who already exist than those which haven't even been conceived yet. Some people argue that single children are more likely to be reclusive and that every child should have numerous siblings. I would say they sort of have a point, but I think it has more to do with the parents being overprotective and discouraging their only child from spending enough time with his or her friends. Children should spend plenty time with other children, but I see no reason why they have to be siblings and not cousins or simply friends. One more thing, I'm pretty much apolitical. Politics is not my area of expertise, so I rarely get involved with those arguments. Others are far better qualified than I am, and I present my ideas as a small part of what I think the solutions to humanity's problems are. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and feel free to disagree with anything I've said, and if I've made any errors in my arguments, please point them out to me. I made a mistake in my last video which Rev Jim Bob kindly pointed out to me. I assumed that Stephen Jay Gould was a Christian because of his famous statement that religion and science are non-overlapping magisteria. He was in fact agnostic. So thanks again for watching, and see you in the next video.